Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have one quick favor to ask. Please hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our newest stories. It only takes a moment. It is completely free, and it helps us continue bringing you more emotional, dramatic, and unforgettable love stories. Every subscribe, like, and comment truly means a lot to us. And before we begin, tell me this. If someone married you only because their brother ran away from the wedding, could you ever believe that their love later became real? Share your answer in the comments below. Thank you so much for being here and supporting the channel. Now, let's meet the main character of today's story. He left you. Reed Calloway said the words quietly, but the silence that followed made them feel louder than the wedding music already beginning downstairs. Ellis Monroe sat near the tall windows of the private dressing suite, dressed in an ivory ceremonial suit with muted sage detailing. His matte graphite wheelchair angled toward the gray-blue Atlantic beyond the Newport estate. For several seconds, Ellis did not move. His deep chestnut eyes stayed on Reed's face. What does that mean? Reed held a folded note in one hand. 20 minutes earlier, he had found Landon's dressing room empty. The tuxedo jacket was still hanging behind the door. The boutonniere remained untouched beside a glass of water. Reed's older brother was gone. Landon left the estate, Reed said. His phone is off. The driver who brought him here this morning says he saw him leave through the service entrance. Ellis looked toward the note. And that? Reed glanced down at the few lines Landon had written. He says he cannot go through with it. Ellis's hands settled against the push rims of his wheelchair. He did not cry. He did not ask where Landon had gone. Did your family send you to tell me? No, Reed's jaw tightened. I came before they decided how much of the truth you were allowed to hear. Something sharpened in Ellis's expression. That sounds like them. Reed stood 6 feet 2 inches tall in a midnight navy suit, his posture controlled even though tension sat clearly across his shoulders. He looked less like a wedding guest now and more like the executive everyone expected to solve a problem before anyone important noticed it existed. Ellis studied him. What happens next? Reed hesitated. Your father is speaking with mine. That was not my question. Reed met his eyes. They want the wedding to continue. Ellis let out a slow breath. With an empty chair? With another groom? The faint warmth disappeared from Ellis's face. Who? Reed did not look away. Me. Outside, the string quartet shifted into another song. Nearly 200 guests were already seated beneath the glass-roofed chapel, surrounded by white orchids, polished brass, and the kind of expensive calm that made disaster look impossible from a distance. Ellis stared at Reed for a long moment. Your brother disappears, and your family sends in the spare. Reed's expression changed slightly. Apparently, that does not bother you. More than I intend to discuss 5 minutes before someone tries to marry me to a stranger. A faint, surprised almost smile touched Ellis's mouth, then vanished. Do you want to marry me? Reed could have softened the answer. He could have spoken about family responsibility, the merger, or protecting the Monroe estate from scandal. Instead, he told the truth. No, Ellis nodded once. Good. Reed frowned. Good. At least one person in this house is being honest with me. Ellis turned his chair slightly toward the windows. Below them, staff moved between the chapel and the reception lawn, unaware that the ceremony they had spent months preparing no longer existed. Then say no with me. Reed followed his gaze. I already did. And my father reminded me that the marriage is tied to the private settlement financing the Monroe restoration projects and the Calloway expansion agreement. Ellis looked back at him. So this is not only about embarrassment. No, how bad? Reed paused. Bad enough that both families are pretending replacing the groom is easier than explaining the truth. Ellis's expression went still. Then I want every number. You should have them. Every clause. Yes. And no one answers for me. Reed's reply came. Immediately. Agreed. Ellis studied him carefully. You agree very quickly for a man who does not want to marry me. Reed's eyes held his. Not wanting the marriage does not mean I think anyone gets to decide for you. For the first time since Reed entered the room, Ellis looked less angry than surprised. He turned toward the door. Then take me to the lawyers. Reed stepped aside instead of reaching for his wheelchair. Ellis noticed. You are not going to help. You did not ask. A faint half-smile appeared. Interesting. Reed opened the door. Ellis rolled forward under his own power, then stopped beside him. If the truth is as bad as they say, we decide together. Reed nodded. Together. Ellis looked toward the chapel below. And if it is not? Reed's voice stayed calm. Then we walk out. The lawyers were already waiting in the estate library when Reed and Ellis arrived. Two representatives from the Calloway family stood near the windows, while the Monroe attorney sat beside a stack of documents thick enough to make the problem feel older than the wedding itself. Ellis positioned his wheelchair at the end of the long walnut table. Reed took the chair across from him instead of beside him. Start with the part everyone is afraid to say out loud, Ellis said. The Monroe attorney adjusted his glasses. The restoration financing for the coastal estate, including the Eastern Greenhouse Project and Payroll Reserve, was structured alongside the Calloway Hospitality Partnership. The marriage settlement is one of the closing conditions. One of them, Ellis repeated. Not the only one. Correct. Reed's father stepped forward. The point is that the condition can still be satisfied today. Ellis looked at him. I asked the lawyer. Reed's father stopped speaking. The attorney continued. If the wedding is canceled and the settlement fails, the lender can suspend the second funding release. The existing bridge financing would then have to be restructured quickly. Ellis's eyes narrowed. Quickly means what? Days, not months. And if restructuring fails? The attorney hesitated. The Monroe family would likely have to sell assets or suspend active projects to cover short-term obligations. Ellis looked down at the pages in front of him. Which projects? The greenhouse restoration, the winter botanical program, and part of the estate hospitality expansion. Payroll? Potentially. Ellis's voice became quieter. How many people? This time the Monroe chief financial officer answered. 47 permanent employees could be affected directly. Seasonal contracts would add more. Silence settled over the library. Reed watched Ellis turn toward the window. From where he sat, the old glass houses were visible beyond the lawn, their white-painted frames catching the cold March light. Ellis had grown up around those buildings. He knew the groundskeepers by name, knew which horticulturist had worked there for 23 years, knew which families depended on the estate long after wedding guests drove home. So if we walk out, Ellis said, 47 people get to pay for a decision they did not make. His father leaned forward. Ellis, no one is asking you to carry that alone. Ellis looked at him. You already did when you signed the agreement. Reed's jaw tightened. He knew the feeling too well. His entire adult life had been built around being the person called after someone else failed. He looked at Ellis across the table and realized the cruelty of the situation was not that they were being asked to marry strangers. It was that everyone had arranged the consequences, so refusing would hurt people who had no voice in the decision. Ellis turned to the attorney. If Reed and I marry today, how long does the marriage condition remain relevant? 6 months. After that, the financing converts under the corporate agreement and the personal condition expires. Ellis looked at Reed. 6 months. 6 months, Reed repeated. Separate finances. Yes. Separate bedrooms. Yes. No one speaks for me about medical decisions, work, travel, property, or my wheelchair. Reed answered without looking toward either family. Agreed. Ellis's gaze stayed on him. No pity. Agreed. No ownership. Agreed. And when we are alone, no pretending this is a romance because everyone downstairs needs a prettier explanation. Reed held his eyes. Agreed. Ellis was silent for several seconds. Then he turned back toward the lawyers. Prepare whatever needs to be amended. His mother released a breath that sounded almost like relief. Ellis stopped her with one look. Do not mistake this for forgiveness. Reed's father began. You are making the responsible choice. Reed spoke before Ellis could answer. No, everyone turned toward him. He is making his own choice after being shown the consequences. There is a difference. Ellis studied him across the table. Reed continued. And I am making mine. If this has to happen so 47 people are not punished for Landon leaving, then Ellis is not carrying that responsibility alone. Less than an hour later, after the attorneys completed the necessary changes to the marriage paperwork and the county clerk confirmed the amended license, the chapel doors opened again. The guests rose when Reed and Ellis entered. There were whispers, but neither man looked toward them. The ceremony was shortened. There were no romantic vows written for someone else. When the officiant asked Reed whether he entered the marriage willingly and with full understanding, he looked directly at Ellis. I enter it knowingly. Ellis's expression shifted by the smallest degree. When the same question came to him, he answered, So do I. Plain platinum bands were exchanged. Applause filled the chapel the moment the officiant declared the ceremony complete, loud enough to sound like relief disguised as celebration. As they moved away from the altar, Reed looked down at the ring on his hand. 6 months. Ellis glanced at his own. Do not sound so devastated. I was attempting optimism. You need practice. Reed almost smiled. Ellis noticed. That was nearly human. Do not tell anyone. For the first time all day, Ellis laughed, brief and quiet, and Reed realized that among everything forced upon them, that sound was the first thing that belonged to neither family. The first week of their marriage passed with the careful distance of two people determined not to make an already complicated arrangement harder. Reed spent most mornings on calls with Callaway Grand Hotels and traveled into Manhattan twice for development meetings, while Ellis worked from a bright study overlooking the Eastern Lawn, surrounded by botanical sketches, accessibility plans, and reports from the Monroe estate. They met at breakfast when schedules allowed and at dinner when neither family required a public appearance. Their conversations were polite, restrained, and usually practical. Then, on the 6th afternoon, the estate hosted a luncheon for investors and preservation partners involved in the botanical expansion. The main hall filled with executives, relatives, staff, and guests moving between the library and terrace. Ellis had nearly reached the terrace doors when several people stopped directly in front of him, blocking the narrow passage while continuing their conversation. Reed was walking a few feet behind. Without thinking, he stepped closer and reached toward the handles of Ellis's wheelchair. The quiet click of the wheel locks stopped him. Ellis looked over his shoulder. Ask. Reed froze with his hands still several inches away. The word was calm, not angry, which made the mistake more obvious. He stepped back immediately. Would you like help getting through? Ellis glanced toward the people blocking the doorway. Yes. Ask them to move. Reed understood the difference. He turned toward the group. Excuse me. Please clear the doorway. They moved aside at once. Ellis released the locks and rolled through under his own power. Reed followed without touching the chair. The entire moment lasted less than a minute, but it stayed with him through the rest of the luncheon. That evening, Reed found Ellis in the glass conservatory reviewing a set of planting notes. I owe you an apology. Ellis looked up. For what? For reaching for the chair without asking. Ellis closed the folder across his lap. You stopped. Because you stopped me first. That is usually how boundaries work. Reed accepted the correction. It will not happen again. Ellis studied him for a moment. Most people say that because they are embarrassed. I am saying it because you were right. A faint half-smile appeared. That is marginally better. The next morning, Ellis entered the breakfast room and found a large roll of architectural drawings beside his coffee. Reed was already seated across from him with a tablet and a cup of black coffee. Ellis looked at the plans. What is this? The East Wing. Reed opened the drawings across the table. The balcony threshold, bathroom storage, door clearance, and the transition into the private dining room. Ellis's expression cooled. You already ordered renovations? No, Reed slid the plans toward him. You decide whether anything changes. Ellis looked down at the drawings again. You could have just hired someone to make it accessible. That would require me to decide what accessible means for you. Ellis lifted his eyes. Reed continued. The architecture team is available this afternoon if you want them. If you do not, nothing happens. For several seconds, Ellis said nothing. Then he pointed toward the balcony door. This needs 2 more inches of clear width. The bathroom does not need a complete redesign. Lower storage is enough. And remove the heavy rug in the hall. Reed glanced toward the page. The antique Persian rug. The decorative obstacle course. Reed almost smiled. Noted. Ellis pointed to the dining room. I also need better knee clearance on one side of the table. Reed nodded. Requested. Ellis looked at him. Good correction. Over the next several days, each change happened only after Ellis approved it. There were no announcements, no displays of generosity, and no one praised Reed for helping. By Friday evening, the East Wing simply worked better. Reed was walking back from the library when he noticed light coming from the conservatory. Ellis sat beneath the warm glasshouse lamps, surrounded by tracing paper, plant catalogs, and a large site plan spread across the work table. Reed stopped at the doorway. May I come in? Ellis looked up, then glanced briefly at his wheelchair before meeting Reed's eyes again. You are learning. Slowly. Come in. Reed stepped inside and looked at the plan. Winding paths crossed nearly 12 unused acres, connecting raised planting beds, shaded seating areas, an accessible greenhouse entrance, and an overlook facing Narragansett Bay. You designed this? For years ago. Why was it never built? Ellis's expression changed. Because my father decided an accessible botanical garden was too expensive for people he did not believe would come. Reed studied the drawings again. Was he right? Ellis met his eyes without hesitation. No, Reed pulled out the chair across from him. Then show me why. Reed remained in the conservatory for nearly an hour while Ellis walked him through the garden plan section by section. The western grounds covered almost 12 acres, stretching from the old glass house toward a line of wind-shaped trees above Narragansett Bay. Ellis had designed broad paths with gentle grades, raised planting beds at different heights, shaded resting areas integrated into the landscape, and a restored greenhouse entrance that every visitor could use without being redirected to a side door. You built accessibility into the design instead of adding it afterward, Reed said. Ellis looked at him. That is the point. He turned another page. People should not have to explain their bodies just to enter a garden. Reed studied the financial projections attached to the plans. These numbers are yours. Every one of them. Seasonal memberships, educational programs, private events, hospitality partnerships, and accessible travel packages with nearby hotels. Reed looked up. You thought beyond the estate. Ellis gave him a faint half-smile. I was trying to build a business, not a sympathy project. The words landed harder than Reed expected. Your father called this too expensive? After my accident, everything I proposed involving accessibility became personal in his eyes. He thought I was designing for myself. Were you? Ellis met his gaze. Partly. Then I realized how many people had been excluded from places like this long before I was. Reed looked back at the plan. The projections were conservative, the visitor estimates carefully segmented, and the maintenance costs more realistic than some hotel expansion proposals he had reviewed that month. May I take a copy? Ellis's expression cooled slightly. For what? Independent review. You do not believe me, Reed answered without defensiveness. I believe you understand the design. I want someone who has no reason to agree with either of us to test the business case. Ellis studied him for several seconds. And if they say I am wrong, then we find out where. And if they say I am right. Reed closed the folder. Then you present it to the board. Ellis raised one eyebrow. I present it. It is your work. 2 days later, the Monroe Estate Library was filled with board members, Callaway executives, and 2 outside hospitality analysts Reed had brought in from New York. Ellis positioned himself at the end of the walnut table with his drawings spread in front of him. Reed sat 3 seats away. For 40 minutes, Ellis explained visitor flow, year-round programming, operating costs, accessible tourism partnerships, and projected revenue. The questions became sharper as the numbers grew larger. One board member leaned back. This is a substantial investment for an accessibility project. Ellis's expression did not change. Then do not call it an accessibility project. Call it a destination property designed correctly. Reed lowered his eyes for a moment, hiding the beginning of a smile. Another executive turned toward him. Reed, are you recommending this because of your marriage? The room went quiet. Ellis's hands became still against the push rims. Reed opened the independent report in front of him. No, he looked around the table. The outside review places projected first-year revenue within 6% of Ellis's estimate, and their long-term visitor forecast is slightly higher. The executive glanced toward Ellis. Reed continued, if you reject the proposal, reject the numbers. Do not reject him because you decided what kind of work he was capable of after an accident. Silence followed. Ellis looked at Reed with an expression Reed had not seen before. Not gratitude. Something more careful than that. Recognition. By the end of the meeting, the board approved a preliminary development budget and authorized final engineering review. Outside, cold March sunlight reflected from the stone terrace. Ellis rolled beside Reed toward the western overlook. You had. Strangers verify everything. Professionals. Strangers with expensive opinions. Usually the most reliable kind. Ellis looked toward the neglected garden below them. And you still let me present. Reed turned to him. There was never anything to let you do. It was yours. Ellis was quiet for a moment. You are becoming inconveniently reasonable. Reed adjusted his cuff. Please do not spread that around. Ellis laughed, brief and real. and Reed realized he had already learned the difference between the smile Ellis used for other people and the one he did not seem able to fake. By late April, the Western Garden had begun to change from paper into something visible. Survey markers crossed the neglected grounds, stone samples lined the edge of the old glass house, and contractors moved between half-finished paths while Ellis reviewed grades, planting heights, seeding clearances, and greenhouse access with the landscape team. Reed still spent most weekdays in Manhattan, but the distance between New York and Newport began shrinking in his schedule for reasons neither man discussed. At first, he returned only for formal project meetings. Then he started arriving on evenings when no meeting had been planned. One Tuesday, Ellis looked up from a planting schedule as Reed entered the private dining room before 7. "You are early." Reed removed his charcoal coat and placed it over the chair across from him. The meeting ended early. Ellis glanced toward the clock. By 3 hours? Reed sat down. Traffic was unusually cooperative. Ellis gave him a dry look. "That may be the least convincing thing you have said since the wedding." Reed almost smiled. Their dinners had become routine without either of them agreeing to it. Ellis preferred mint tea after the meal and left one window open whenever rain moved in from the bay. Reed read hotel reports while waiting for dessert and adjusted his cuff whenever a conversation became more personal than he intended. Neither mentioned these habits. They simply began remembering them. One evening, Reed found black coffee waiting beside a stack of garden invoices. "You remembered." Ellis continued reviewing a site plan. "The kitchen remembered." "You told them." "That remains unproven." Reed looked at him for a second longer than necessary. By May, the empty chair across from Ellis had become part of dinner before Reed even arrived. Then, on a Thursday night, a development meeting in Manhattan stretched far past schedule. Reed considered sending a message twice and dismissed the idea both times. They were not that kind of marriage. At 9:20, he finally entered the dining room and stopped. Ellis was still there. A botanical journal lay open beside him. 2 plates sat on the table, both untouched and cold. Ellis looked up. "You are late." Reed glanced at the second place setting. "Were you waiting?" Ellis turned one page. "Dinner was." Reed sat down slowly. "Dinner reads professional journals now. It is ambitious." "Apparently." Ellis's mouth curved faintly. Reed looked toward the kitchen door. "I should have called." Ellis met his eyes. "Yes." There was no accusation in the answer, only expectation. Somehow that mattered more. "I am sorry." Ellis closed the journal. Apology accepted. After that night, Reed sent a message whenever he would be late. Ellis never thanked him. Reed never explained why he continued. A week later, Ellis stayed at the conservatory past dinner to finish revised planting plans. Reed ate alone. The chair across from him remained empty. He tried reading a quarterly report, then realized he had read the same paragraph 4 times. At 10, he walked to the conservatory and found Ellis beneath the warm glasshouse lights, surrounded by drawings, trays of young herbs, and soil samples. Reed stopped at the doorway. "May I come in?" Ellis looked up and smiled. "You still remember to ask." "I was told it was important." "By someone difficult, I assume." "Extremely." Ellis laughed. Reed stepped inside and placed a covered plate on the work table beside him. Dinner was waiting. Ellis looked at the plate, then at Reed. "Was it?" Reed held his gaze. This time, he did not reach for his cuff. "Yes." Ellis went quiet. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the conservatory roof. Reed looked toward the open window near Ellis's desk. "You left it open." "I like the sound." Reed pulled the chair across from him and sat down. "So do I." Ellis studied him for a moment, then returned to the plans. Neither man said anything else. They did not need to. For the first time, the silence between them did not feel like distance. By late August, the Western Garden had transformed enough that even the people who had doubted Ellis's plan stopped calling it an experiment. The main paths were finished, the restored glass house was open for testing, and the first shaded seating areas overlooked Narragansett Bay exactly as he had drawn them months earlier. Reed had also stopped pretending his frequent returns from Manhattan were entirely about the project. More nights ended in Newport now. More mornings began across the same breakfast table. He knew which contractors Ellis trusted, which reports made him frown, and how the smallest half-smile meant Ellis was about to say something sharp. Ellis knew Reed no longer scheduled unnecessary dinners in New York, knew he read financial documents when anxious, and new silence from him usually meant too many thoughts rather than too few. That fragile familiarity broke on a Thursday afternoon when a black sedan stopped beneath the estate portico. Reed was in the library reviewing hotel expansion plans when his father entered without knocking. "Landon is back." Reed looked up slowly. "Where has he been?" "California. He says he needed time." Reed closed the folder. He had almost 6 months. His father ignored the remark. "He wants to speak with the family." Reed's expression hardened. "And Ellis?" The answer came from the doorway. "I need to speak with him too." Landon stood there in a dark gray suit, looking almost unchanged except for the uncertainty in his eyes. Reed rose. "Why?" Landon glanced toward the hall. "Because I owe him an explanation." By the time they reached the drawing room, both families were already gathered. Ellis sat near the windows in a muted sage shirt, his matte graphite wheelchair angled slightly away from the table. His hands rested calmly on the push rims. Landon stood opposite him. "I panicked," Landon said. "I thought if I stayed, I would spend the rest of my life living someone else's plan." Ellis held his gaze. "So you left me to live it instead?" Landon lowered his eyes. "Yes." The honesty quieted the room. "I was selfish." Ellis's voice remained level. "That part is accurate." Reed almost heard the dry humor he had come to know, but there was no warmth behind it. Landon took a slow breath. "I came back because I want to make this right." Ellis's expression sharpened. "What does that mean?" Reed's father answered before Landon could. "The original engagement can still be honored once the 6-month term ends. The financing is nearly converted, and with Landon prepared to resume his responsibility, the families can restore the intended arrangement." Ellis went completely still. "Restore?" His mother leaned forward. "No one is forcing you. You are discussing my next marriage while I am still wearing the ring from this one." Silence followed. Landon looked toward Ellis. "I am not asking you to decide today. I only want the chance to do what I should have done before." Ellis did not answer him. Instead, his eyes moved to Reed. "And you?" Reed felt every person in the room turn toward him. He should have answered immediately. He knew that. But years of solving crises took over. His mind went to merger documents, financing conversion, voting rights, settlement clauses, and what Landon's return might change legally. "I need to know what this does to the agreement," Reed said. The warmth disappeared from Ellis's face. "Of course." Reed heard the mistake as soon as the words left him. "That is not what I meant." Ellis held his gaze. "Then what did you mean?" Reed stepped closer, then stopped several feet away. "I mean no one in this room gets to decide where you go next." That was not the question. Reed's jaw tightened. The answer he wanted to give felt too large to say in front of both families, too permanent to release before he understood what it would change. That hesitation lasted only seconds. For Ellis, it was enough. He unlocked his wheels. Landon spoke softly. "Ellis, please." Ellis turned toward him. "I was never yours to return to." Then he looked at Reed. The disappointment in his deep chestnut eyes was quieter than anger and far harder to face. "And I am not going to sit here while everyone decides which brother I belong to." He rolled out of the room under his own power. Reed remained beside the table, finally understanding that silence could become an answer even when he had never intended to give one. Ellis did not come to dinner that night. Reed sat across from the empty chair until the untouched place setting began to feel louder than any argument they could have had. He opened a quarterly report, read the same paragraph 3 times, and finally closed it. Every thought returned to the drawing room, to Ellis asking one simple question, and to Reed answering with contracts, because contracts were safer than saying what he actually felt. By morning, the estate was quiet except for staff preparing the western garden for another inspection. Reed found Ellis in the conservatory packing sketchbooks, botanical samples, and project folders into 2 canvas cases. Warm light filtered through the glass roof and caught along the matte graphite frame of his wheelchair. "You are leaving," Reed said. Ellis did not look up. "For New York." "For how long?" "I have not decided." Reed stepped inside, then stopped several feet away. "Because of yesterday?" Ellis closed one folder. "Because yesterday reminded me what this arrangement becomes the moment someone else enters the room." Reed's jaw tightened. "I told them no one gets to decide where you go next. After you asked what Landon's return did to the agreement." Reed looked down briefly. "I was trying to understand what changed legally." Ellis finally looked at him. "Exactly." He reached beneath a stack of papers and placed a thin envelope on the work table. Reed recognized the law firm printed in the corner. What is that? Divorce papers. Reed stared at the envelope. The 6 months are not over yet. They will be soon. I do not want this. Ellis's expression softened for one painful second. That is not the same as choosing me. Reed went still. The words landed harder than anything Landon had said. Ellis continued, quieter now. I never asked you to pretend the wedding was romantic. I never asked you to become someone. You were not. But somewhere between the garden, the late dinners, the messages from Manhattan, and the fact that you started remembering what I needed without deciding it for me, I thought this had become ours. Reed held his gaze. It did. Then why could you not say that yesterday? Because both families were standing there waiting to turn whatever I said into another condition. And I was standing there waiting to find out whether I mattered more than the condition. Silence filled the conservatory. Ellis rested his hands on the push rims. So answer me now. Reed nodded once. Ask. Ellis looked directly at him. If Landon had walked down that aisle in March, would you ever have looked at me the way you do now? Reed felt the answer he wished he could give and the truth he could actually defend. He chose the truth. I do not know. Ellis's eyes lowered briefly. Reed stepped forward, then stopped himself again. But that is not the whole answer. Ellis looked back at him. Then what is? Reed forced himself to speak without hiding behind business language. I did not know you then. I know you now. I know you hate weak coffee. I know you leave the window open when it rains. I know you can look at 12 neglected acres and see a future everyone else missed. I know you wait for dinner and pretend you do not. Ellis's eyes brightened, but his voice remained steady. And Reed swallowed. And the thought of you leaving this house feels like losing the only part of this marriage that was ever real. Ellis closed his eyes for a moment. That still sounds like losing. Reed said nothing. Ellis opened them again. I need choosing. He pushed the envelope toward Reed. Sign them. Reed looked at the papers. You want freedom. I want to know that if I ever stay with you, it is because neither family, no contract, and no abandoned wedding is holding me there. Reed's hand closed around the envelope. And if you do not come back. Ellis met his eyes. Then at least I leave as myself. Not Landon's abandoned fiancé. Not your substitute husband. Just Ellis. 2 hours later, Reed stood beneath the Newport Estate portico while a car waited nearby. Ellis rolled toward it, then stopped when Reed called his name. I do not know how to fix this yet. Ellis looked back. Then do not fix me. Reed stayed silent. Ellis's voice softened. Fix the part that made everyone think I could ever belong to either brother. Then he left, and Reed remained beneath the late August sky holding the unsigned papers, finally understanding that loving Ellis would mean giving him the one thing their marriage had never begun with, a completely free choice. Reed signed the divorce papers the next morning. He did it alone in the Newport Estate library, with the late August sunlight falling across the walnut table and Ellis's empty place at dinner still more present in his mind than anything else in the house. The signature looked ordinary. That was what unsettled him most. 6 months of careful distance, shared meals, quiet habits, garden plans, and conversations that had become more important than he intended could be reduced to one line of ink. By 9:30, Reed was seated across from his father, Landon, Ellis's parents, and the attorneys representing both families. The revised merger documents were spread across the table. Reed's father spoke first. There is still a practical solution. Landon is willing to resume the original engagement once the current term ends. Reed looked at him. No. The room went silent. Landon shifted in his chair. Reed, I know I handled this badly, but I am trying to take responsibility. Reed's voice remained controlled. Taking responsibility does not mean putting Ellis back where you left him. Landon looked down. Reed turned toward the attorneys. Remove every clause that makes Ellis's marriage a condition of the financing conversion, the family settlement, or the merger. One attorney frowned. That would require restructuring the closing terms. Then restructure them. His father leaned forward. Do you understand what that could cost you? Yes. Your preferred equity position could be reduced. Then reduce it. You could lose voting protections. Reed adjusted his cuff, then stopped when he realized what he was doing. Then I lose them. His father stared at him. You are making a financial decision. Because you are emotional. Reed met his eyes. No. I am correcting a structure that should never have treated a person as part of the consideration. Ellis's father looked away. Reed continued. If this agreement only works because Ellis has to belong to one Calloway brother or the other, then the agreement is wrong. Landon spoke quietly. You love him. Reed looked at his brother. This time, there was no hesitation. Yes. The word changed the room, but Reed did not take it back. By early afternoon, the attorneys had outlined a new structure. Reed surrendered several financial protections he had spent years earning, and Landon signed a formal withdrawal from every personal condition tied to the original engagement. Before Reed left, Landon stopped him near the library door. For what it is worth, I am sorry. Reed looked at him. Tell Ellis that when he is ready to hear it. Reed drove to Manhattan that evening with the signed divorce papers and the amended transaction documents beside him. Ellis's botanical studio occupied the ground floor of a renovated brick building with wide windows, open work tables, plant samples, and enough space to move freely between drafting stations. Reed found him reviewing garden elevations beneath warm pendant lights. Ellis looked up when he entered. His gaze moved immediately to the folder in Reed's hand. You signed. Yes. Reed placed the divorce papers on the work table. Ellis looked at the signature, then at him. And the agreement? Reed set a second document beside the first. Your marriage is no longer part of it. Neither is Landon's. The financing can convert without either family deciding who you are supposed to marry. Ellis's expression shifted slowly. What did you give up? Preferred equity. Some voting protections. Reed. They were mine to give up. Ellis rested one hand against the edge of the table. You did not have to do that. Yes, I did. Why? Reed held his gaze. Because you were right. I kept thinking the problem was how to keep you. The real problem was that everyone built a system where keeping you was treated like a business condition. Ellis looked down at the documents. And now there is nothing tying you to me. The words hurt, but Reed said them anyway. The first wedding happened because Landon left. I will not ask for another one until you know I would choose you even if he had stayed. Ellis looked at him for a long moment. How am I supposed to know that? Reed stepped back instead of closer. Because I am not asking you to come back tonight. Ellis's eyes softened. Reed continued. I am not asking you to forgive me. I am not asking you to keep the marriage. I wanted you to have a choice that did not cost anyone a greenhouse, a job, a hotel agreement, or a family settlement. Ellis glanced at the divorce papers again. And if I file these? Reed swallowed. Then I respect it. Even if that is not what you want. Especially then. Silence filled the studio. Reed turned toward the door. Reed. He stopped. Ellis looked at the papers between them. You finally answered the question. Reed faced him. Which one? Ellis's voice was quiet. Whether you could choose me without keeping me. Reed said nothing. He did not need to. Then he left the studio alone. And for the first time since the wedding, everything that happened next belonged entirely to Ellis. 3 weeks later, the Western Garden opened for its first private preview beneath a clear September sky. The paths Ellis had designed curved through late-blooming roses, lavender, coastal grasses, and shaded seating areas before reaching the restored glasshouse and the overlook above Narragansett Bay. Nothing about the garden made accessibility feel separate or added afterward. Every entrance, resting place, planting bed, and pathway simply worked for the people using them. Reed arrived alone. He wore a midnight navy suit without a tie and carried no folder, no legal documents, and no prepared argument. For the first time since the wedding, he came with nothing to negotiate. He stayed near the edge of the gathering while donors, hospitality executives, preservation groups, and invited guests moved through the garden. Ellis was near the central terrace, dressed in ivory and muted sage, his matte graphite wheelchair positioned beside a display of botanical illustrations. He was explaining the project to a small group when he finally noticed Reed. Their eyes met across the path. Reed did not move toward him. He waited. Nearly 20 minutes passed before Ellis finished speaking and rolled across the terrace. You came. Reed looked around the garden. You built something worth seeing. Ellis's mouth curved slightly. That almost sounded generous. Do not expect it often. The familiar rhythm returned for a moment, then softened into silence. Ellis glanced toward the restored glass house. The divorce papers are still in my studio. Reed kept his expression steady. That is your decision. Ellis looked back at him. You really mean that? Yes. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Ellis rested his hands lightly on the push rims. You finally learned to wait. Reed held his gaze. I learned to ask. The words settled between them with the weight of everything that had happened since the crowded doorway months earlier. Reed drew in a slow breath. May I stay? Ellis's eyes softened. At the preview? Today? After today? In whatever place you are willing to give me. Ellis studied him carefully. You still sound like you are negotiating. Reed nodded once. Then I will try again. He did not step closer. I choose you. Ellis went still. Reed continued before fear could turn the words back into silence. Not because Landon left. Not because our families needed a marriage. Not because of the merger. I choose the man who told me to ask before I touched his chair, who saw a future in 12 neglected acres, who remembers my coffee and pretends dinner was the one waiting, and who walked away when staying would have cost him his self-respect. Ellis's eyes brightened with emotion. That is a very detailed answer. You deserved one. And if I say no? Reed answered without hesitation. Then I leave, and nothing I changed gets undone. Ellis looked at him for a long moment. Then the faint half-smile Reed knew so well appeared. May I correct one thing? Always. Dinner did not wait for you. Reed almost smiled. Of course not. Ellis's voice softened. I did. The admission changed something in Reed's face completely. Ellis looked toward the garden, then back at him. You asked if you may stay. Reed nodded. Yes. Ellis held his gaze. Then stay. For months later, they stood beneath the restored glasshouse roof, while winter sunlight reflected softly across the paths Ellis had designed. The second ceremony was small and entirely their own. There were no merger papers, no emergency attorneys, and no substitute groom. Landon attended after apologizing privately to Ellis and making it clear he expected nothing in return. When the officiant reached the rings, Reed looked at Ellis before reaching for his hand. May I? Ellis laughed softly. You really did learn. Reed took his hand only after Ellis nodded. 1 year later, Callaway Grand Hotels launched an accessibility initiative based on Ellis's design standards, while Ellis kept his independent studio and continued leading projects on his own terms. Most evenings, Reed still returned to Newport before dinner. On the rare nights he was late, Ellis would look up as he entered and say, You are late. Reed would take the seat across from him. Were you waiting? Ellis would glance at the untouched second plate, then back at the man he had chosen freely. Dinner was